Hey y'all, it's an honor to share with you guys this morning. You might be wondering, hey Matt, I thought you guys were gathering now at Highfields. That's correct. We did. We had an awesome service this morning, and it was a beautiful time to gather together. And then I noticed something because I still wanted to upload the messages and stuff because we still have some people that aren't able to, feel comfortable enough to gather with us again. So I try to upload the videos for people who are away or people, who aren't comfortable gathering again. And I noticed halfway through my sermon that I did not have a camera set up. So the reason you're getting this message in our old kind of studio looking space that we used to do the messages in is because I forgot to record the message this morning. And I only realized that towards the end. And so here I am giving my second edition of the message. So hopefully this time it might be better for you guys. The people that were there this morning can, watch it again and see if it's as good as it was live. And sorry for that. I know it's awesome, even watching the message, seeing us gather again, it was a bit exciting to have that. So apologies for forgetting to have things set up this morning, and make sure not to make that mistake again. But it's an honor to share with you anyways, and it's an honor to kind of close off our series that's been about generosity and having a mindset of abundance. Today I want to look at when do we have a mindset of abundance. So far in this series we've looked at what the biblical mindset of abundance is. Then we kind of said, well, why should we have it? And then from that we go, how do we have it? And we looked at that. And today I want to look at when do we have it. So is it just a Monday to Friday thing? Can I take a Sabbath? How does it work? Do I have to live my whole life with this generosity mindset and having a mindset of abundance? And to help us unpack that this morning, I want to look at a verse found in Proverbs, and it's in chapter 11, and it's verse 25 to 30. And Proverbs is what we call wisdom literature to the ancient. So ancient Jews used to love their wisdom. They love to try to figure out what it is, kind of how it grounds you to everything else. And this is part of that collection. And the book of Proverbs is really cool because it's a collection of sayings from this tradition and from kings and different people that were gathered by men in Hezekiah's court. If you don't know who Hezekiah is, he was the king of Judah after the split of the empire. So after the north and the south split, you had a king named Hezekiah who was ruling Judah, and he was the king of Judah. And he got his men in his court to kind of collect these sayings. So if you ever look at your subheadings in Proverbs, you'll notice chapters 1 to 10 appears to be like a long introduction to this book. Seems to be like them kind of paving the way of what the book is about, what they're aiming to do with these collections and that kind of stuff. And then you get to chapter 10, and from chapter 10 till probably verse 16 of chapter 22, it's under the subheading Proverbs of Solomon. And then in chapter 22, it kind of switches subheadings, and it changes to 30 sayings of the wise, or wise men, or wise kings, depending how it's phrased in your translation. And that happens till chapter 25. And then we get a new subheading from chapter 25 to 30, called More Proverbs of Solomon. Then at chapter 30, we get a subheading called the Sayings of Agur, or Agar. I don't know how to say that right. It's A-G-U-R. I think it's Agur. I don't know. We'll see. I said it differently this morning too, but Sayings of Agur. And then chapter 31 is under a subheading called the Sayings of King Lemuel. With the conclusion of Proverbs, the last chapter of it, is under a subheading called Noble Wife, or Noble Woman, or Epilogue of the Wife of Noble Character. And the reason I'm telling you all this stuff and all this information is because this book is a collection of ancient wisdom given to Israel by God through their traditions and their kings. Sorry, the page wants to fly off. We'll stop to stay. And it's just really beautiful. It's their whole tradition, all these kings, and God just really speaking through it, and this collection of wisdom. That's why I think it's a great book for us to look at today. There's a quote I want to share with you. It's from a guy named Pete Enns. So he's a theologian. He has a PhD in biblical studies. He's got other degrees as well. He's a professor of biblical studies at Eastern University. So he knows a little bit about the Bible. And this is what he says about the book of Proverbs. In the thinking of the writer of Proverbs, wisdom is being connected to the very foundation of the cosmos. There we see wisdom tied to creation itself, to the tree of life, to the foundation of the earth, to establishing the heavens. I think that's a beautiful quote, and it really shows how this wisdom journey was vital to early Jews. And that's why so often in these wisdom writings, they would write stuff in to tie it down to the story of creation. In order to bring this groundedness, to try to ground everything. They thought wisdom was a part of creation itself. And they were all about this wisdom journey. They were all about grounding. And it's why often during wisdom literature that we read in the Bible, we'll see him referring to creation, trying to get this grounding over and over again. And that is why I think this book is a perfect book for us to look at, to figure out when should we have this biblical mindset of abundance, and when should I live a generous life. So let's unpack that now. If you want, feel free to flip to your Proverbs chapter 11, and we'll start at verse 25, and I'll just read to verse 27. And this is what it says. A generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. People curse the one who hoards grain, but they pray God's blessing on the one who is willing to sell. Whoever seeks good finds favor, but evil comes to the one who searches for it. And I want to pause there for a moment, just because how true is that, all of that, but especially that last line where it talks about, but evil comes to the one who searches for it. I feel like so often we know those people, or we've been in those situations where we're just always focused on the negative. And that's all we seem to find, that's all we seem to discover over and over and over and over and over again. And I think it's really interesting too when you look at psychology. We're wired to notice the negative. With programs that I've done in schools as a chaplain, you often, in one of them, you try to get kids to say one good thing about their week. And the whole idea of that is you're trying to get them to kind of notice the good, so they see that more. So I think there's so much truth in that so often what we focus on tends to be what we find and what we see. And I also think Solomon's kind of encouraging us, if we read this and we're trying to figure out what does this mean for, living a generous life and having a mindset of abundance, I really feel like he's encouraging us to always allow God's generosity to flow out of us. Spreading the blessing of God to those around us. I mean, it says stuff like, a generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. Talks about people praying blessing for the ones who are willing to sell. There's all this pointing that we should always live this generous life and have this mindset of abundance, that there's enough in creation. Let's keep reading and just read the last two verses real quick. And this is what it says in verse 28. Those who trust in their riches will fall, but the righteous will thrive like a green leaf. Whoever brings ruin on their family will inherit only wind, and the fool will be servant to the wise. The fruit of the righteous is a tree of life, and the one who is wise saves lives. Man, there's so much in that teaching. Like in verse 28, he kind of touches on the story of Job, which I think is really interesting because it kind of seems like there's this constant flow in these ancient texts where they're trying to connect it to the ancient story of Israel. And he's kind of connecting it to the story of Job. And if you don't know the story of Job, he has a lot of awful things happen. And he has these friends who come around him and they're trying to help, but they're trying to say like he has done things to deserve it, so he must have some sin. And one of the times they come up to him and they start, it's in chapter 31 and it's verse 24 to 28, they start pointing out that he kind of trusted money. Job kind of in his last defense is like, what are you talking about? I didn't do that. And I love how Solomon's kind of touching on that, kind of tying that in to this Proverbs. And I love how it's kind of tied in, I think, a crucial part of us being a good steward of creation, when he connects it to the tree of life, is us having this generosity, us living a generous life. And it leads to producing fruits. And it's connecting it back to the beginning of everything, to the story of creation that we find in the Bible. And we also read, if we're wise, we will save the lives of others. To me, that means we are always meant to have this generosity in our lives. We're always meant to live out of this mindset of abundance, looking for these moments to be generous to others, looking for the opportunities that God opens up for us to be generous to others. And I want to make something clear, because far too often we have used this to abandon our families. So sometimes there would be people following God and really feel led to go do some amazing work for God, and they would sacrifice their family for that. That's not being generous. So if I go home tonight and, we have a little daughter that's not feeling well, if I go home and I say, all right, Kim, you're staying with our sick daughter and our 2 other kids, and I'm going to go out and I'm just going to find people to be generous to. You got to look after the kids. I'm doing what God's called me to do. I don't believe that's the case. I believe sometimes we need to look out for our family. Not sometimes, we need to look out for our family. We need to have priorities and boundaries. So I'm not saying to sacrifice your family or responsibilities or anything like that to be generous. But what I'm trying to say is, are we looking out for the moments, the invitations that we get invited to take a step into this bigger picture, into this bigger story? Are we looking out for those as a church, as followers of Christ? Are we waiting for them? When we see them come, do we step out or do we step back? And you might be asking yourself, well, what does that look like? What does it mean to look out for these opportunities? To be willing to take that step out. What does it look like? Well, for me, I think it maybe look something like what a teacher did for me once. I had a teacher named Mr. V is what we called him. And he was my science teacher in year 7. And I went to a school that was a great school. I don't know how I got into it. It was a smarty pants school. So you had to keep a certain grade point average, or else you couldn't go to the school. And they were really strict on science and maths. That was important. And one time in his class, he was my science teacher for biology. I was a bit of a knucklehead of a kid, so I had a really bad grade. I had a 51. And, I think my parents even got called into a meeting with the principal of the school and other stuff. And basically, I was told if I didn't get my grade up to a 72, I wasn't going to be able to go there next year. And for me, that was hard to hear. That's where my friends were. I didn't want to go somewhere else. I'm an awkward enough person as it is, trying to go to a new school to make friends. Are you crazy? So I remember I really busted my butt. And Mr. V was great. He took time for me. He helped me with stuff. And I really worked my butt off to get that grade up. And about, 2 or 3 days before the end of, the term, and before we get report cards, Mr. V asked me to stay after class because he wanted to show me something. And he was pretty excited on his face. And he didn't know I needed a 72. He just knew I needed to get my grade up a lot. So I remember he sat down with me and he showed me, he goes, oh, Matt, guess what? He gets on his computer, shows me, it's like, you got a 70. And he was really excited because I went from a 51 to a 70. So like, that's pretty impressive to do that quick. And I remember I was a bit upset, and he kind of goes, "Oh, why are you upset?" And I said, "Oh, I needed a 72. So I was like, "I guess I won't be coming here next year." I was like, "That's all right though." I gave it a good try, and made a joke about it, left the room, did like any year 7 kid, went to have a little, quick cry in the toilets, wipe my eyes, and then go out and joke about it. And I remember my report card came home, and I'm kind of nervous, and I'm like, "Oh crap, Dad's going to be grumpy after finding a new school," and all this different stuff. And on my report card, it said a 72. I remember when I saw Mr. V again, it was pretty sure it was next year, went and tracked him down, and I said, "Oh, thank you so much." He goes, "Oh, don't thank me." He's like, "I just looked at some more of your stuff and saw there was some extra credit that you could do, or extra credit stuff that you've done, trying to get your grade up." And I think for me in that moment, it was awesome to actually achieve something. To work my butt off. As a kid who was just, the jokester kid, didn't think I was smart, Mr. V helped me see I could actually do stuff. He went out of his way to find extra credit stuff. Who knows if he even did find extra credit stuff, but nonetheless, he went out of his way to be generous to me. To bless me for my hard work that he saw me put into the subject. Where I was able to get the exact grade that I needed. That to me is stepping out and being available to be generous to others. Being willing to take that step in to the story. And church, I wonder, what would it look like if we stepped into this kind of story more? If we really were a church that was generous, had a mindset of abundance, that there's enough. I mean, wouldn't it be awesome if we were known for our generosity in the surrounding community of Highfields? If, we looked for the invitations, not sacrificing family and responsibilities and all that other stuff, but we looked for the invitations that God sets up to take that step into a bigger story. What would it look like? How many less needs would there be in our community? How awesome would it be to have people talk about Highfields Church and say, "You know what, that church is generous. If you need something and they can help, they do." And I feel like God's really asking us to lean into that. To really think about what that would look like. This series we've been unpacking generosity, how it all stemmed from this mindset of abundance and realizing that there's enough in creation. God created our world good if we just steward it well. Realizing that. What does it look like if we look for those opportunities? If we're that Mr. V for someone else? And this doesn't mean going above and beyond and you got to skip through hoops. It can be the simplest of things. Maybe getting a text from a family that you know and just stopping because there's something going on in their world and texting them back a couple times, keeping the conversation going. Making invitations to be there and even going out of your way to be there when possible. And before I close in prayer, I really want to ask us as a church to sit, to reflect, to wrestle with what does it look like for you and for me to live a generous life and hold on to this biblical mindset of abundance. What could God be eager to do in our communities? And are we willing to sit and really reflect on that? Really look out for those opportunities. And I pray that we are, church. Pray that as we finish this series and we move on to our next series, that we won't forget about being generous. that will try to hold on to that biblical mindset of abundance, looking for the opportunities to show generosity, to be a blessing to someone else. And I really want to thank you for your time, and I'm just going to close in prayer. God, I thank you so much for who you are. I thank you for your love and for your grace and for your mercy. And I thank you for this series you've been leading us through on generosity and having a biblical mindset of abundance. I pray that you help us grab hold of this idea that there's enough in creation, and you created creation good. And if we steward it well, there's enough for all. I pray that you have that flow out of us so where we can live this generous life, looking for those opportunities to show generosity to others, knowing the amazing impact and blessing it can have on other people's lives and on our lives, not financially, but at our hearts, filling a need that money and other things can never fill. I thank you so much for who you are. And I just pray for us as a church that you help us be known as a generous church. You help us really sit and reflect with what it looks like for us to live a generous life and hold on to this biblical mindset of abundance into the future. Thank you so much for our gathering this morning. And I thank you so much for those who are joining and watching this. In your amazing, matchless name, amen. Thank you all so much, and may God's grace and peace be with you.